Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and over the next few weeks, I'm going to take you with me on the ground for the conversations I had with Israelis as myself and my colleague, Isaac Woodward, went on a solidarity and humanitarian trip to Israel. We led 16 young Christian professionals on our Philos Leadership Institute trip, and we witnessed what happened on October 7th, the horrific destruction and damage, the psychological warfare that still continues, and the resilience of those living in Israel who have all been affected by this war and by the October 7th attacks. These conversations are touching, they are difficult, and they bear witness to what happened, and I hope that we never forget. On this episode of the Philos Project podcast for our mini-series, we're going to be talking to Ronen, who leads our tours for the Philos Leadership Institute trips. After his mandatory service in the IDF, he joined the reserves and still serves today in the Northern Front. Not only does he know the vast history of the region and the geopolitics that shape it, but his time serving in the North provides great insight on the potential escalation in the Northern Front.
Okay, so we'll just keep this super casual just because I don't like interviewing people I know because it makes it awkward. So we can just keep it like we would like on a PLI trip, like a conversation. Okay, we'll just jump in. Ronen, if you could just share with us where you're from in Israel, how long you've lived in Israel, and I know you lived in the United States, so maybe what the differences in living in the US versus living in Israel have been.
So, hello everyone. My name is Ronen Gurievsky, and I've been living in Israel for most of my life, minus a few years in Seattle as a baby. All my life I've been living in Israel, and I'm currently living in a suburb of Tel Aviv, just northeast of Tel Aviv. Yeah, it's a quiet, boring place, and it's a good place to raise kids. I'm married, and I have two daughters, and it's a good place to raise a family.
And what has your experience been working with Christians? Because you've done PLI now for many, many years. So what's that space like in occupying? I feel like you're like this cultural ambassador for Christians coming to Israel. What's that experience been like?
My experience with guiding different Christian groups, and sometimes they are multi denominations, and sometimes single denominations. I think that I enjoy seeing the beauty, the holiness, and the importance of this land from a lens that isn't my Jewish lens, isn't part of my upbringing, but I also enjoy giving people the opportunity to view their Christianity from a different lens, seeing how the bedrock of Christianity has so much Jewish elements in them. It's not just that Jesus was Jewish, but it's the environment, and it's the time and place where the cradle of Christianity starts that is also a very, very important moment in Jewish history.
And what has your experience been now bringing Christians after October 7th? I know we've shared a really somber week together last week. How is that bringing people into that grief? Maybe if you are also comfortable sharing where you were on October 7th, how you heard about it, and how do you think trips might change going forward with this post October 7th?
Yeah. So I've had a few Christian tourists, but the first Christian group was PLI. It was an amazing experience. I think that there is this connection to Israel that Jews have, that it is the homeland of the Jewish people, and they feel some sort of default connection to it. But then there is the Christian connection to this land, which is beyond the religious connection and the physical connection, but there is a common sense of camaraderie, and there is a common sense of sharing values. Values that are in their foundations are Judeo-Christian, and they are the pillars of the Western values, the modern values that we cherish today. And by having a group by choice coming to Israel and being part of this experience, it was very exciting. It was very exciting. It was everyone that had met the group and was asking me, who are these people and where are they from, were deeply moved by the fact that these are people who don't necessarily have some sort of ancestral connection to the Jewish people, but choose to be connected to our story, and to the common history, and to the future, and are willing to anchor themselves in the now, which is a very dire, a very sad now. We're still not in the aftermath of these events. It's been going on for 6 months now, and we don't know when this is going to be over. But people, especially Philos, still choose to walk with us in this path, hand in hand.
I just want to say thank you too for inviting us into that space. I kind of walked away in the tension of obviously feeling a connection to the Jewish people, but also not wanting to impose in this grief that I don't directly share in. And I felt almost like this sense of guilt leaving right when the missiles came from Iran, because I was very aware of the fact that I could leave, but I also was struck by most of the people we met in Israel would choose to stay even if given that option. And so just walking away with a lot to contemplate, but also just thanking you and everyone we spoke with for allowing us into that space. And ultimately, like you were saying, to bear witness to what happened, because it's still very much happening. And so that was an honor. So I just wanted to say thank you before moving forward. So if you could share what you've been doing since the start of the war. I know that you were called up. What have you and many of your comrades been processing and thinking? Now, obviously, we're past 6 months into this conflict. And then maybe in a few questions, we can talk about your role in the north and Hezbollah and that potentially escalating to a longer term conflict.
So I'll briefly talk about my experience on October 7th, and I'll explain a little bit of what I've done in reserves for almost 5 months. I was, just like the entire country, woken up by a siren, 6:30 a.m. I didn't really feel any urge or sense of emergency, but I did wake up my wife, and I took my daughters to the safe space that we have in our building, and just put everyone to sleep. Right after the sirens were over, we heard the Iron Dome intercept the missiles or the rockets that were aimed at us, and we've been in this before, so I can't say that I was immediately nervous, but within the following minutes, within the first half hour, I would say I was already informed that one of my friends who lives in a kibbutz down south is in the bomb shelter of his house, and that there are terrorists in his kibbutz. And throughout that morning, just getting little pieces of information from the media and from all my friends who live in the Western Negev area in the Gaza envelope, and putting together small pieces of a great puzzle, slowly understanding that this is something on a much wider scale that no one has anticipated. Um, Very soon, we understood later that morning that the army has been overwhelmed in a very well and very efficient planned attack that managed to cripple all the capabilities that the army had in the area of preventing and also having first respond units arrive to whatever scene there was. And by that time, I was already called up and I was actually making my way to report to my unit in the north. For the first month and a half of my service up north, I was doing a lot of mostly intelligence work. And after we had completed our missions, we were released, but immediately reassigned, basically attached to other units. And I joined a brigade that was stationed on the Lebanese border, on the northeastern Lebanese border, in an area that there isn't a physical obstacle, there isn't a fence, there isn't some sort of barrier. There is just a very symbolic UN marking of the border between Israel and Lebanon. And fortunately for me, this was an area that I've been to in my mandatory service about 20 years ago. So I had my acquaintance. I knew the challenges. I knew the difficulties, and I served there. I was part of a small squad that was in sort of like the one of the immediate responding squads for this whole area. And that's where I spent the rest of the 3.5 months I had in reserves. My role as a medical personnel and basically combat infantry, which is pretty much what I did there. I Yeah, and we've learned a lot about Hezbollah, about this conflict. It was very, very eye opening in so many ways.
Can you speak to some of the unique challenges from a security perspective in the north compared to the south? Because I know when we were in Israel, you mentioned Israel had been preparing for an attack similar to October 7th, but thought it would come maybe from the north. So if you just unpack that, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I think that we also have to accept the role that Hezbollah plays right now in Lebanese politics. But Hezbollah as a regional militia, which is part of it's the tip of the spear for the different Iranian proxies and part of their resistant movements. Um, I think that for most of the greater intelligence community, whether it's Israeli or foreign, everyone had assumed that this kind of scenario would actually come from the north and not necessarily from the south. Even in worst case scenario, from the south, there could be an invasion, but not on this scale. Something that we have seen with Hezbollah is that they have improved and they are very much dominant with their anti-tank capabilities. They have not just perfected their training, but they have also perfected their weaponry, optimizing different technologies, taking old Russian or Chinese technology and converting it and making the adjustments, taking an old Israeli anti-tank missile and perfecting it to their capabilities, reverse engineering it and perfecting it to their capabilities. Their accuracy in the rest of their armory is quite impressive. Hezbollah is not the guerrilla militia that we were used to 30, 40 years ago. But Hezbollah is well equipped with very accurate missiles and rockets that really that really minimize the margin of error that allows them to have a much greater capability to attack targets in Israel and make those attacks sufficient and create deterrence. And their ranges have also grown from over 5 kilometers, using very large warheads. And for the first time, we see the use of different types of UAVs, drones, and I think since 1973, the Yom Kippur War, for the first time, Israeli soldiers have some sort of threat that is coming to them from the sky. No Israeli soldier, in my opinion, unless they do they do serve in any of the Iron Dome units and things like that, no Israeli soldier has ever been trained or even thought of the potential scenario that the next threat is going to be coming from the air, from the sky. And this is also the first time that we see one conflict, which is happening in the Ukraine, with the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, and there is a Ukrainianization of this conflict over here. Certain methods, certain means, certain tools are being implemented on the battleground over here. This is also a wonderful way for Iran to display its weaponry to the world, and by that, growing its potential clientele in the security market. And there is something that has to be said about how Hezbollah is acting out. In the past, Hezbollah would never engage in some sort of fighting with Israel while there is a skirmish in the Gaza Strip. Usually they're going to launch their novelty rockets. Usually these rockets wouldn't sometimes be intercepted, but they would just fall in open spaces, showing their support in the resistance movements, showing their support in Hamas and their struggle to liberate Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem. And this is the first time that Hezbollah is literally jeopardizing and sacrificing its assets and its people and taking an active role in fighting another frontier with Israel, but it hasn't escalated up until recently. Um, part of what Hezbollah has achieved is, and that's, I think, in a very, very effective way for their morale and for their support, is evacuating the entire northern border and all the communities that live there. We're talking about over 60,000 people in the north of Israel that for 6 months now have not gone to their homes, with farmland not being taken care of, with homes being abandoned, and of course homes being attacked as well. And Hezbollah has actually made a significant achievement by that. and suddenly they see themselves as a force that has to be recognized. It's a strong statement for the country they operate from, Lebanon, when they want to portray themselves as the protectors of Lebanon, as the liberators from the occupation. And it's also an amazing display of Iranian proxy capabilities. Up until a few days ago, we could say that Iran is fighting a multi-front war against Israel without even attacking Israel, because we started this war being attacked by Hamas. It had immediately affected the Lebanese border, and then it also escalates a little bit on the Syrian border. But at the same time, we have another Iranian proxy from Yemen who's firing at Israel. Israel was fighting, was up until a few days ago, fighting in 4 different frontiers, 4 Iranian proxies. And right now, Iran itself had joined this attack as a retaliation to the assassination that happened in the consulate in Damascus just a couple of weeks ago. And I think this reveals the true face of what Iran wants to achieve.
This is kind of going back to October 7th, but I think a lot of people, especially in the West, were speculating that Hezbollah would join in with Hamas immediately on October 7th. Is there a reason that Hezbollah didn't immediately open up the northern front on October 7th?
I think that there are a few reasons why Hezbollah has not joined fighting on such a large scale. And the first and most practical reason is that I genuinely believe that Hezbollah was also somewhat surprised from this attack and did not prepare for this attack. They were already ready to fire towards Israel. They probably had some sort of stash of rockets already aimed to Israel that just could be released almost immediately. And Hezbollah also needs to fight an inner war that is happening right now in Lebanon. And they have to gain the support and release a lot of their pressure that they have, that is a lot of pressure that is on them right now in Lebanon. They don't have they're not fighting for the Lebanese people. They don't necessarily have the support of the vast majority of the Lebanese people. Obviously, the vast majority of Shiites in Lebanon, but Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah are not Lebanese patriots. And the average person in Lebanon understands that. They recognize it, and they also see how clear the Iranian footprint, how strong the Iranian footprint is in Lebanon. What they also see is that wherever Iran does put its foot in and does have effect, brings to a complete deterioration of the country. What Lebanon was afraid that Israel could do to it during or after the Second Lebanese War in 2006, Hezbollah has done to Lebanon by itself, by weakening the government, weakening the local police, not allowing Lebanon to crown the next president, who has to be a Christian, because they just won't vote on it on parliament. Hezbollah has made its way into Lebanese politics, and from being, the second democratic country in the world, from being one of the most diverse countries, the second democratic country in the Middle East, and being the most diverse country in one of the most diverse countries in Lebanon, different minorities in Lebanon that are not affiliated with Hezbollah suffer the wrath of Iran through Hezbollah. The currency is in a 200% inflation. The average salary is about the equivalent to $1 a day in Lebanon, and this country has completely eroded itself by thanks to Hezbollah. And right now, I don't think that Lebanon is willing to go on this adventure that is really going to cripple this country. And it's going to have it already is going through a very, very hard time, but it's going to be even harder for Lebanon to rehabilitate itself in case we do go into a war. And the fingers won't be pointed at Israel, the fingers will be pointed at Hezbollah. The problem is that, again, Hezbollah is not an organization that looks after the interests of Lebanon. It's an organization that just performs and acts out, what the head of the snake wants, which is Iran. So it's really not clear. One thing that I would be a little bit concerned about is that there aren't enough diplomatic elements that are on the scene, like the negotiations between Israel and Hamas. There isn't some sort of strong diplomatic effort to postpone or try and lower the flames with a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And I'm specifically saying this is a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, not between Israel and Lebanon.
And could you also maybe highlight what's happening in Syria? I know there's some smaller jihadist groups there. Is it as organized as Hezbollah? Do they cooperate with Hezbollah?
So talking about Syria, we have to address the situation of the Syrian army post or almost in the aftermath of the civil war in Syria. We have a very large army that a lot of it has been decommissionized, whether units have defected or a lot of units have suffered from losses of resources, capabilities, and obviously soldiers just fighting other rebel groups inside Syria. And in this pretty big vacuum is a very good cushion for Iranian proxies to start and operate from within Syria. We know that before the civil war in Syria, Iran's support in Hezbollah was through Syria. Iran could not bring supplies directly into Lebanon and bring them to Hezbollah, but they had to they could fly it to Syria or by land. And from Syria, from the land borders that obviously the Syrian regime and its allies, Hezbollah, can control, it's much easier to weaponize, to increase the arsenal that Hezbollah has. And when the civil war in Syria starts, Hezbollah immediately comes to, I don't know to say to the rescue, but for the aid of the Assad army, fighting together. And Hezbollah fighters have also gained a lot of experience on the ground. With that experience and with that assistance of Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, the Assad regime is somewhat in debt to Iran, but is also in debt to the Russians. There is another superpower in this equation that is fighting another war in a different frontier, and also has its interests within Syria. Having Iran and Russia in the same, I would call it a romance between two hedgehogs, in the same bed or in the same little hole in the ground, that they want the place to themselves. They can't sustain their control without the other. They have to collaborate, but they have different interests, and their interests are clearly, Russia is there for Russia's interests, and Iran is there for Iran's interest. So they're frenemies in Syria, but they're very close and tight when it comes to uh, Iran supplying Russia with weaponry for the campaign in the Ukraine. And one thing that we can leave with is that it's unofficial recognition, even by Israel, that Russian MPs, military police, are supposed to be stationed along the Israeli-Syrian border on the Syrian side. And they are the ones that are supposed to monitor and control and prevent from Iranian proxies to establish their presence, permanent presence, along the Israeli-Syrian border. I would say that in the past over a year, they have been reluctant to do so. The Assad army is so frail and so weak that sometimes it's just very easy to bribe a general or an officer within the Syrian army and allow to use their resources and even though the location of the base as a place to launch attacks on Israel by Iranian proxies. And there's a large and growing number of Iranian proxy terrorists in Syria, and they are coming from all over the region. They are coming from Pakistan, they're coming from Afghanistan, from different parts of Iran. Obviously, there are a lot of Iraqis there, and different tribes that are collaborating or participating. Again, this political vacuum that is left in Syria is leaving the entire Syrian grounds for grabs, and the first parties for grabs are Iran and Russia. Currently, the situation is that Israel still preserves the right to retaliate as Israel has done up until now, whenever there is an attack coming in from Syria. But I don't think that right now Syria is the main focus of a potential threat. Right now, the main focus of a potential threat is most likely coming in from Lebanon. We still have some sort of strategic depth with Syria, a certain understanding with the Russians that Israel is, and will firmly retaliate against any threat or any attack that comes from Syria.
Hmm. And is there maybe a potential threat that Russia would get involved in a larger regional conflict? Let's say that there is a larger scale war, or do you think that Russia is too preoccupied with the war front in the Ukraine?
I'm not sure specifically about what the what the Russian agenda is, what the potential Russian strategy is. I don't know. I'm not a specialist for Russia, but what I can say is that there's this new growing force. If at the end of World War II and throughout the Cold War there was NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, I think the new call it the new triple threat is this Russia, China, Iran group that is growing. They're obviously feeding off each other. Iran is producing, and at the same time, Russia and China are purchasing oil from Iran. The West is slowly losing its dependence on oil, but in China and Russia, it's still very, very relevant. And that's why we also see the West taking a step back in its interests in the Middle East, because oil is not seen as a very valuable resource in the near future. And Asia is still is, and like I said before, Iran is helping Russia with the battleground in the Ukraine. It is producing weaponry, it's selling it to Russia, and it's just an amazing display. It's this showcase of the Iranian capabilities and their weaponry to show to the world. One of the things that have empowered Iran indirectly was invading two of its neighbors that were its biggest potential threat. Once the U.S. has weakened Afghanistan, invaded Iraq, and weakened Iraq, it allows Iran to expand beyond its borders throughout the entire Middle East, really without any effort, because they pretty much control the Iraqi regime. There is a small majority of Shiites in Iraq, just about 60%. And Afghanistan to them right now is not some sort of substantial threat. This is a country that has to rehabilitate itself. And indirectly, the US has strengthened Iran in so many ways. And it's very, very clear, and we don't have to read between the lines to understand what Iran is trying to gain. In multiple speeches, Iranian leaders have said, death to America, death to Israel. By 2040, Israel will be destroyed. There isn't any other country today in the world that can allow itself to speak in the annihilation of another people and another country. Maybe Russia and the Ukraine. They're talking about taking over the Ukrainian government, not necessarily the Ukrainian people. Iran is explicitly saying that it's going to destroy Israel, that it wants to destroy Israel. And by the way, that's also the main reason that they're not giving up on their nuclear capabilities. Whatever Iran has tried to accomplish, and very, very much successfully, is basically postponing, slowing down, eroding these negotiations for them to continue with their nuclear plan. We look at Iran right now at a certain time and place in history, but Iran looks at the region in a much, much wider scale. That it looks at Iraq, and Iran is looking at Libya, and is looking at Syria, and looking at the Ukraine, all four countries that have lost their nuclear capabilities. The US didn't allow Libya to have, Israel did not allow Iraq and Syria to have, and the Ukraine surrendered their nuclear capabilities to Russia, being promised that, no harm will be done to them. And look what happened to all of these countries. They have completely collapsed from the inside. If Iran wants call it an insurance policy for the continuity and the preservance of their regime, it's by gaining nuclear capabilities, not necessarily exercising it, but knowing that this is going to create deterrence, not just for the region, but for the entire world, knowing that this is a nuclear superpower, that you just can't attack them in a way that will jeopardize their regime, because they might just exercise their capabilities in case they're under, a significant threat.
And you kind of spoke to this, but what is the U.S. role in this conflict, like zooming out in the early 2000s, that's led to a lot of where we're at today? And maybe zooming in a little bit, what's the Biden administration's shift in regional foreign policy? How has it undermined Israel's security and ultimately the United States' security?
It's a loaded question, and I think that I'm also not an expert on U.S. foreign policy in the region, but someone who comes from the region and sees what de facto the foreign policy is, in my opinion, it hasn't been very successful for the interest of the American allies in the region. If China is providing about 70% of the weaponry and the capabilities that Iran has, the US should look at Iran as another part of the equation in the whole Russia China, and basically look at them in sort of like one circle, one triangle. China buys 90% of Iran's oil, and the Russian, Chinese, Iranian economies, who are under some sort of serious embargo by the West, are living off of each other. And their support of each other is what is sustaining these countries. And of course, they have other countries who are collaborators. India still purchases from all of them. North Korea, obviously Syria, and other countries in the region are also dependent on these three countries: Iran, Russia, China. I think that the U.S. has to be leading some sort of coalition or union against these three countries. And the US is signaling that it's not interested in engaging in another violent conflict in the region. And obviously, looking at it from the American standpoint, the cost, the lives, and the entire war effort in Iraq and Afghanistan has definitely affected American society from within. But at the end of the day, if you look at how the U.S. is portrayed, not within, but how the U.S. is portrayed from without, and how it's viewed from the locals here, then it seems like the U.S. is weak. Going on a negotiation over a negotiation and making threats that eventually don't manifest themselves is a symbol of weakness. And the lack of consistency in American and different administrations and their policies is also portrayed as some sort of weakness. I think that the U.S. does not want to engage in a violent conflict, and that's why they are allowing themselves to negotiate with terrorist organizations and with terrorist regimes. I think that there is some sort of Western perception, this false vision that the West is capable of engineering the Middle East. And the U.S., instead of taking some sort of, consistent stubbornness in looking out for the interests of its allies, is actually trying to appease the enemy, is trying to compromise with enemies in order to postpone an inevitable war. Looking away from everything that Iran and its proxies are doing in international water, and turning a blind eye from a very large and thriving drug industry coming in from Syria, and currently right now completely ignoring the Iranian nuclear plan. This plan, I'm pretty sure, is still going on. And I think that the U.S., for whatever reason, hasn't necessarily spoken in the language of the locals, but has always used a different type of vocabulary, dictionary, in a region that just doesn't speak. It understands the words that are coming out of the mouth, but just doesn't accept how things are conducted by Americans. And the Israeli interests throughout history weren't always eye to eye with the American interests. We have to recognize that. But the lack of sort of like trying to lower the flames or to prevent some sort of conflict on the long run is harming the U.S. I think that a complete surrender and a 100% victory has to be the American, Western, Israeli, Sunni moderate coalition's interest, without negotiations, without trying to appease and to satisfy terrorists, giving them more money, giving them more leeway, turning a blind eye. Anyone that wants this region to thrive has to get rid of the extremists, not to weaken them. I hear a lot of people talking about how difficult it is, or almost impossible, to kill an ideology or to change an ideology. Ideologies have changed. In world history, capitalism is a fairly new ideology. Socialism is a new ideology. 800 years ago, the Crusades were over because the ideology has changed, and we are capable of changing ideologies. And it's about time that the moderate Middle Eastern countries, along with the Western support led by the US, make the effort of changing the ideology. It is starting on the government level, it is starting with the ground level, and trying to have both of those ends meet somewhere in the middle. And we start with education. We give people opportunities, and when people will see more of that and a consistency, then I genuinely believe that ideologies can change. Absolutely.
Can you explain what appeasement is for our audience who might not understand what a policy of appeasement with a regime is and why it's detrimental? I think back to the West with Hitler before World War II, which I know typically we try not to use Nazis as the historic benchmark because they were such an outlier. But what does appeasement look like in foreign policy?
What does it look like in foreign policy? Well, mentioning Germany in World War II, we don't have to go to the U.S. We can actually talk about the Munich Agreement that was signed with Chamberlain. This non-aggression agreement, and Nazi Germany asked for the Sedots in what is today the area of Czechoslovakia, annexing that part, and the two regional superpowers, France and Britain, that were supposed to protect, smaller allies, failed to do so. Not because they didn't want to, but because their memories of World War I still lingered in everyone's collective memory. And the horrors of World War I, of the officers and the soldiers that fought there, that are now, the older generation in politics and things like that, were willing to sacrifice everything to avoid another war. By doing that, they didn't just surrender to Hitler's demands, but their appetite grew, and Hitler got more than what he originally negotiated for, because he saw them as weak, that they were willing to do anything, including, double cross or stab another friendly allied country that they're supposed to protect. They were willing to do even that in order to prevent war. And when you do that, when tyrants see that, they see it as weakness. And that weakness eventually will blow up in your face. And I think we see the same thing here in the region. Whether it's the American North Korean nuclear plan, that today North Korea has nuclear capabilities. It's going to be impossible for any superpower in the world to take over the North Korean regime by the Un family without suffering tremendous losses. And it's going to be the same with Iran if the world doesn't take action now. Um, whenever the US or the West has implemented sanctions, we saw the immediate effect on it right away. And whenever, Iran or some sort of ally of Iran in the region twitched a muscle, then the US released, a few billions or lowered the sanctions and things like that. And that is a sign of weakness. And they allow themselves to behave like a regional bully, and instead of punishing the bully and or kicking out the bully, they're actually trying to provide for the bully with these small victories so he doesn't act out too much. But these small victories draw a much bigger and greater picture. And these small victories are giving them a lot more support and a lot more confidence. And it turns into some sort of consistent pattern of keeping the world hostage in its ill behavior on the global scale. And this is exactly what Iran is doing. Iran is normalizing its radical regime and the values that it's exporting into all the neighbors, all the countries, in the region, and knowing that there isn't right now some sort of greater superpower that is willing to tackle them. And they just feel like someone has kicked the red carpet for them and they can just walk through. And I think we're not too far from that day if the world doesn't take action soon.
Well, Ronen, thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to having you on soon again.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening. Hope to see you soon.